Daniel, you know I'm a huge fan of your organization. We're very honored to have you. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Jack. Thanks so much for having me, and everybody who's here. Thanks for coming and listening. It's really special to get to speak to all of you like this. Yeah, let me tell you. Let me start off by telling you a little bit about how we got started, because it actually happened 20 years ago this year, and it's a crazy story. The first thing that happened was, not by the way, Honest Reporting is a nonprofit organization. We're supported entirely by donations from small individual donors, just people like you, not you high school students, but maybe some of the older folks here who are already making a living. And the way we got started was in the year 2000, 20 years ago. The Second Intifada was going on, and this picture appeared here in the New York Times. Let's see if I can share the screen here. This picture right here was what appeared in the New York Times. It was published in Associated Press, so it made it into all sorts of newspapers all over the world. And you can look, it says right here, the caption, an Israeli policeman and a Palestinian on the Temple Mount. And if you look up, and this is sort of the analysis we do, the first thing we do at Honest Reporting is just say, if I look at this article and I see something right off the bat that's wrong or inconsistent, I already know that something's off and I can look deeper. And then we do background research and say, okay, what isn't being shown here that should be? So the first thing you look is, if you look over the right shoulder of the police officer, I'm sure there's some of you here who can read and speak Hebrew. I know we've got some yeshiva bochers here. So if you look over his right shoulder, you'll see it says right there, "leliter soler," which means the price per liter for diesel fuel, and so right off the bat, remember it says this is on the Temple Mount. You've been to the Temple Mount, there isn't a gas station on the Temple Mount. So right off the bat, that the caption editor really doesn't know what they're doing in the sense of understanding the Middle East. But that's not the worst thing here. Is the kid with the blood on his face over there that you see in the picture, that's not a Palestinian. That's a Jewish kid from Chicago named Tuvia Grossman, who came to Israel to study in yeshiva. And the soldier behind him, he's holding up his club to ward off this mob of Palestinians that was attacking him. So the soldier is actually protecting this kid from getting beaten to death. And the soldier is a member of the Border Patrol. He's actually a Druze guy, which Druze, I don't know if you're familiar with the culture, but their main language is Arabic, and sometimes they self-identify as Arab, sometimes they don't. But to me, it's very touching because the New York Times got everything exactly backwards. This is an Arab-speaking Druze member of the Israeli armed forces protecting a Jewish American kid from a Palestinian mob. And I always like to say, this conflict we talk about in the Middle East, it's not Jews versus Arabs. It's not Israelis versus Palestinians. And this picture shows all that. It's people who care about peace and coexistence against people who want to destroy peace and coexistence. And that's exactly what we see in this picture. And it really should have been a touching picture that shows people who care working to work for peace and safety. But instead, they have this caption that is not only untrue, but just completely inverts the whole situation. And the problem was that the New York Times and the Associated Press had a narrative that they wanted to tell, and they were not going to let the truth interfere with a good story. And the people so some people saw this picture, including Tuvia Grossman's father, who was horrified, and they started an email campaign. This was a little bit before social media really took off, so they started an email list and like a chain letter, and got a lot of people to write in to the New York Times and to the Associated Press to demand that they change the photo caption, and they succeeded. And that list of people became the seeds of Honest Reporting, which even today is still based on that power of grassroots movements. It's about people who, when we'll write a critique of an article and we'll issue a little call to action, say, hey, write to the editor of this newspaper and share your thoughts. And it really does make a difference, and we manage to actually make changes. So what I like to do right now is first by talking to you a little bit about something we're working on this week. And then I'll go on to show you some work that I did in a debate against Omar Barghouti on live international television, and Omar Barghouti is the founder, the co-founder of the BDS movement, and talk to you a little bit about how you can talk about these issues in a way that is likely to reach people who don't necessarily agree with you already. And that's really the most important people to speak to, is the people who aren't already agreeing with you. But starting off with what's going on this week. Well, as you know, this nuclear scientist in Iran named Zadeh was killed in a strike that most people are attributing to Israel, and as far as we know, probably was Israel. And the European Union and also some talking heads, including a former CIA chief, spoke out and said that this is a war crime and against international law and a criminal act. And well, now we're getting into my area because I'm a lawyer. And when it comes to law, I jump in and say, okay, law is not just like some impressionist painting that means whatever you want it to mean. There's actual law out there. And, you know, everyone's entitled to their own opinions, but you're not entitled to your own laws. And I'm going to catch you on that. And so I wrote an article on our website, and that got some good traction. And then also we have a division of Honest Reporting called Media Central, and Media Central does press conferences for journalists. So it's sort of a carrot and the stick kind of thing. Honest Reporting is when journalists get it wrong, we'll criticize them and pressure them. But we also have Media Central, who's there to help journalists and give them good information and take them to where the story is at. So, for example, if rockets are falling on outside of Gaza, we'll actually put journalists on a bus and take them down to the communities near Gaza and have them see it for themselves. And that's valuable because they talk to the local residents. And if rockets are falling, the journalists are running into the shelters just like everyone else. And it makes a difference in the reporting. And we really do see that this makes a positive difference, just getting people good information. But also a lot of what we do there is press conferences. And usually we just have outside experts, but this particular time I said, you know what, as a lawyer, I count as an expert in this field. So I'm going to, I presented on a panel in one of our press conferences on this issue. And what I said to the journalists was, let me tell you how the law works, because you have people out there saying this violates international law, but they're not telling you why or how or which laws it violates. And my personal feeling is that if you're going to start talking about the law, two expert lawyers can disagree on a legal conclusion, but there's a legal analysis that gets you to that conclusion, and that is something that you should always see no matter who you're talking to. And you as a journalist should be asking anyone you talk to, hey, how do you feel about this particular analysis? How does this play? How did you get to that conclusion? Otherwise, if you can't do that with someone, they may be trying to mislead you, or they may not know what they're talking about. And so I took it from the point of view is I'm going to try and help journalists get this extra tool to help them in doing good professional work. Some journalists really are unprofessional or come with an agenda, but some journalists really do want to be professional and just don't know better and are just sort of swept away by the narrative. So I thought these are the journalists I'm really trying to reach, the ones who want to be as professional as possible. And what I said is, I don't know if any of you out there are lawyers or studying law or want to become lawyers, but the first thing you do, and this is what I always say when I teach classes, is if you're analyzing a legal issue, the first thing you ask is, what area of law am I talking about? Are we talking about contracts? Are we talking about real estate? Are we talking about copyright? In this case, we're talking about the laws of war. And the laws of war in this particular case are governed by the Geneva Convention #4, and specifically by what's called the first additional protocol to the Fourth Geneva Convention. And it sounds a little bit technical, but the point is there is actual law out there and you can look it up, and it's written in the English language. It's also written in other languages because it's international, and you can read it for yourself, and you don't need to be a lawyer to be able to read this and understand it, although it helps. So first, directing us to the right law. And then once you look at that law, there's basically 3 questions that tell you whether killing a person in a targeted killing is a war crime. And there are people who think that any kind of targeted killing or any kind of drone strike is a war crime. But the truth is that there's actual legal standards that help you figure this out. And the first question, you have to ask 3 questions. And that's what I said to the journalists. If somebody isn't asking and answering these 3 questions, they're probably misleading you. They don't have to answer the 3 questions in the same way that I do, but they have to at least be asking and answering them. Otherwise, you should push them. And if you push them and you can't get answers, you should ask yourself whether they're really a credible source. So the first question is, are there hostilities? These laws apply where there are hostilities. Now, the Geneva Conventions, that basically means war, but they intentionally don't use the word war, because if they use the word war, it's sort of like, well, if we just don't declare war, we could still fight each other and we're no longer bound by the rules of the Geneva Convention. And the people who wrote the Geneva Convention said, no, we don't want people to get away with that. So we're not saying war. You don't have to declare war. If it's any kind of hostilities, then these laws apply. So are there hostilities between Israel and Iran? We're assuming it's Israel now. I don't know that for sure, but that's pretty much what we're assuming. My conclusion, right? So the law, you can't argue about the law, but you can argue about the legal conclusion. And the legal conclusion I come to is, yes, I believe there are hostilities, because Iran constantly says they want to wipe Israel off the map and eliminate the Zionist entity. And then they have proxy wars where they have groups like Hezbollah and Hamas and others actively working to try and accomplish that. And you even have Iranian generals in Syria who are working on firing rockets in the direction of Israel. So that clearly there are military hostilities at work, and the nuclear program is part of them. The next question is, are we talking about a civilian? The laws of war say you cannot target a civilian. You can never target a civilian. Now, that doesn't mean that civilians can never be killed, but civilians can never be the target. Now, this doesn't apply. Now, if you have a civilian, for example, who is engaged in hostilities, then they lose the protections of the Geneva Convention. So you ask yourself, is this person a civilian? If yes, is this person a civilian who is engaged in hostilities? And in this case, we're talking about this guy, Zadeh. The Washington Post wrote a profile of this guy, and it had 1,055 words. 8 of those words were scientist. 2 of those words were professor. None of those words were the guy's actual title, which is Brigadier General in the IRGC, which is Iran's elite military force. Like, this guy is a major military general, and they didn't even write that in the profile in the Washington Post. And this is really what honest reporting is all about. Our job is not to just be pro-Israel blindly. Israel is a modern Western liberal democracy, and that's something to be proud of. And like any modern democracy, Israel's not perfect and gets things wrong. And when Israel does, we don't try to defend Israel blindly. But Israel deserves at least a fair chance. Israel deserves people to speak about the issues in a way that's open and fair. So if you want to say that it was wrong to kill this nuclear scientist, you can have that opinion. But if you need to cover up the guy's title and what he's all about in order to support your opinion, you kind of have to ask yourself, if you're so sure that you're right, why are you covering up the facts? You know, if you're really right, you should be able to give people all the facts and still be persuasive, and they'll still agree with you. But clearly the Washington Post and other publications were not doing that. Instead, they were writing that he was a professor and a scientist, which he was, but he was also a general. So because he was a general, and not just because he had a rank and a uniform, but he was working on a military nuclear weapons program, mostly on military bases, and doing it as part of military hostilities. So in every possible way, he was definitely not a civilian, in my analysis. Now, someone else could say, no, I think he really was a civilian for this reason or that reason. I don't know how you could make that case, but at the very least, what you don't get a choice in is you have to ask the question and you have to answer it. The third question that you have to ask and answer, and this is, by the way, the European Union, for example, didn't ask or answer any of these questions. They didn't do a legal analysis. They just said it violates international law. Didn't even say which laws. So the third question is, did the attacking power make an effort to try and avoid civilian casualties? Like I said, you can never target civilians, but a civilian might be killed on accident. If a civilian is killed by accident, the question is, did the power make an effort to try and avoid it, right? So for example, if you just go blowing up an entire town, you know, that would violate international law. If the town has an army base in it and you blow up the army base and a civilian happened to be near the army base and got killed, but your strike was very targeted and was really only targeted on that army base, then that would fit that third criteria of trying to avoid civilian casualties. And this really comes into play, for example, where you have rocket launchers in Gaza firing rockets at Israel, and they put these rocket launchers in civilian neighborhoods intentionally to use people as human shields. And I remember once when the siren sounded in Tel Aviv, and I wasn't near a shelter, so I had to do what you do when you're not near a shelter. I had to get down on the ground and interlace my hands over my head and put my face into the ground, because if a rocket falls nearby, the shrapnel could fly at you, and shrapnel usually flies up. So you want to put the most vulnerable parts of your body down as low as possible. And while I'm laying there on the ground with my hands interlaced over my head, I'm thinking to myself, chances are that Israel probably knew about this rocket launcher and probably chose to not destroy it because there were civilians nearby. And I appreciate that, and I'm proud that I live in a country that cares in that way. But at the same time, by not destroying that rocket launcher, Israel allowed it to continue launching. And now I'm laying here on the ground hoping that I don't get killed or injured. And guess what? I'm a civilian too. So Israel faces this cruel choice. If you blow up the rocket launcher, you could harm civilians. But if you don't blow up the rocket launcher, that could also harm civilians. And so that brings us to that third criteria in the Geneva Convention, which is that you are allowed to target military hardware or military personnel as long as you are making an effort to avoid civilian casualties. Even if some civilians die, as long as you weren't targeting them and you were trying to avoid hurting them, then you've met the standards of the Geneva Convention. And so I made the case that these three questions: are there hostilities? Yes. Was this Fakhrizadeh a civilian? No. Did the attacking power, presumably Israel, act in a way to try and avoid civilian casualties? Well, they launched an attack that was so targeted that it killed one person, and that person wasn't even a civilian. So there were 0 civilian casualties. And, sometimes you might say, well, maybe you shouldn't be attacking people because, we care about people and we don't want people to get hurt. And going out and assassinating people like that sounds more like being a thug or street crime than a real war. But what you have to think about is, sure, if you stayed home and did nothing, nobody would get hurt today. But then that nuclear program would grow, and Israel and the United States and all the countries in the free world have an obligation to protect their own civilians. So doing nothing isn't an option, because then Israeli civilians are in danger. So if you do something, what are you going to do? And the answer is, if you're not going to do a targeted strike, the other option is to do a larger, wider military engagement, to have an aerial attack that tries to destroy the nuclear facilities. That's much more likely to cause civilian casualties. So you want to take the view that a highly targeted strike that killed 0 civilians is actually much more in keeping with the spirit behind the Geneva Convention than a wider military campaign that might endanger many more civilians. And so that was the point that I was making to the journalists. And my point to them was also, you don't have to necessarily accept my answers to these 3 questions, which are my legal conclusions, but you have to ask and answer all 3 of the questions. And anybody who doesn't do that is probably misleading you. So that's just an example of some of the work that we're doing right now. And let me show you, we've got, this was based on a paper that I wrote, which I'll show you right now, which is on our website. You can see, is killing Iran's nuclear scientists a war crime? And if you look through it, you can see that we've embedded tweets and we have links. So every time you see red, that's another link, and there's tons of them in here. So if you want to check the original law and the original quotes, you can click to all those things and check everything out. This is at HonestReporting.com, and we put it here for you so that you can educate yourself to be able to be more effective speaking about these things publicly. And then we also put it out there for the journalists who can check it. And this is how we do our work every day. We're always reading the news and writing articles. So that was my that was what I was working on this past week, and we're working on a lot of other things too. There's a lot going on in the news, but this was certainly one of them. So now I'd like to show you a little bit about this debate that I had with Omar Barghouti, and I'll pull up once again the share screen. And let's talk a little bit about how I asked the question, how the questions were asked to me and how I responded to them. Let's take a look.
A Palestinian-led campaign against Israel. It's called Boycott, Divestment, Sanctions, or BDS.
BDS aims to end injustice and inequality and denial of human rights.
What is your response to that?
Okay, so, I have two basic rules when it comes to a debate or a conversation or anything like that. One, try to be smart and likable. You want to have just enough knowledge and jargon and facts to make it clear that you know what you're talking about, but not so much that you seem kind of cold and heartless. And the second is meet people where they are, which might not be where you are. Different people have different values. Someone who leans to the right might be more interested in issues like security. Someone who leans to the left might be more interested in issues like human rights and progressive values. I personally believe that Israel can win on any of those topics. We're a real country, we're a modern, liberal, Western democracy, which is a phrase that I often repeat. And whether you're speaking to people on the right or on the left, people who are young, people who are old, if you know where their values are and where they're coming from, you can speak about Israel in a way that meets their values. That's not, by the way, true for every topic with every issue or country in the world, but I do believe it is true for Israel. So I said, so you can see that Omar Barghouti is doing that very well. He's throwing in all those progressive buzzwords that are really touching to young people, denial of human rights and equality, and it really is engaging and touching. So how am I going to counter that, right? Am I going to go and then say human rights don't matter, equality doesn't matter, Palestinians are all terrorists? I start talking that way, and guess what? You're going to see you're going to really alienate people who care about that. I notice someone here is raising her hand. We're going to take questions at the end, so please definitely raise your question or write it in the comments, and we'll take it at the end. But I do care about the question, and I will definitely answer it. So the question is, how are you going to answer this in a way that that reaches people where they are and makes you appear smart and likable and touching the values that are relevant to your audience? Remember, my audience here is not Omar Barghouti. My audience is all the people watching who I can't even see. And so you just have to have a sense of who you're talking about and talking to. So fortunately, I'm familiar with Barghouti, and I did a little research in advance, and here was how I answered.
Well, my response is really not relevant. I think what's important is Mr. Barghouti's response. In 2013, he said in a lecture, and I quote, "Definitely, most definitely, we oppose a Jewish state in any part of Palestine. The purpose of the BDS movement is to put an end to the Jewish state of Israel in any borders whatsoever. It's a destructive movement. And what's most disturbing is that the movement misleads young people who really do care about social justice."
So you see what I did there? I'm talking about, there's three kinds of people in the world. People who already agree with you, and there's no point in trying to convince them of anything. People who will never agree with you, and there's no point in trying to convince them of anything. And then there's the vast majority of people, who are people who could kind of go either way, either because they don't care about the issue that much, or they don't know about it that much, or whatever it is. And those are really the most important people to speak to, first of all, because it's the majority of people, and second of all, because it's the place where you actually have a chance of making a difference. So if somebody says, if somebody really believes in progressive liberal values and human rights, they don't want to see equality, they don't want to see injustice, but they also don't want to see Israel destroyed, or Israel destroyed as a Jewish state. And by pointing out that this is what Omar Barghouti, in his own words, is really advocating for, it allows me to tap into those values without disagreeing with those values. Now, a lot of people who are involved in BDS don't really believe those things, but the leaders of BDS are leading that movement in this direction, and the young people who take part in it should understand what they're being a part of.
Palestinians are living not just under military occupation, not just under a system of colonization, but under a system of apartheid. So BDS aims to end this oppression so that Palestinians can enjoy freedom, justice, and equality.
Look at that. Apartheid, oppression, freedom, justice, and equality. He's hitting all the right words. He's doing the things that I teach really well. So now what are you going to do? And if we were in a smaller group, I might actually ask you and have you answer, and we could have a little back and forth. or in a group that's just too large to make that practical. But I'll tell you, when I do this, a lot of times I'd say to someone, all right, how would you answer this? And the answer usually would be, well, say Israel is not an apartheid state, and Israel is not oppressive, and Israel doesn't have inequality. And it's so tempting to do that, but it's a trap, because what you've done is what psychologists and people who work in marketing, which are very related fields, call you're creating a word association, where now you've just said the word Israel and the word apartheid together in the same sentence, and Israel and oppression, and Israel and inequality over and over again together in the same sentence. And you're also being on the defensive, and you're playing his game, and it's not a productive way to go. So what can you do? What I did is to say, instead of talking about what Israel isn't, I'll talk about what Israel is. So the question is, how do I talk about Israel not being an apartheid state without using the word apartheid and without using the word not? And while I was at it, because I know a bit of Omar Barghouti's history and had done my homework in advance, I was able to chip away a little bit at his credibility while I was at it.
Mr. Barghouti was born in Qatar, he was raised in Egypt, and he got his degree at the University of Tel Aviv, where he studied together with Christians and Jews and Arabs, all experiencing equal rights and equal opportunity in a country where Arabs serve as Supreme Court justices, as lawyers and doctors and actors, and everything that human beings do, including members of government. And when asked about this at UCLA in 2016, Mr. Barghouti said that they were collaborators.
All right, so you can see how I did that there, which is first discrediting him a little bit. You know, this isn't a guy who grew up in some refugee camp. This is a very privileged person from a privileged family who grew up in countries around the world before finally attending the University of Tel Aviv, for goodness sake. You know, if you know what apartheid is, you know it's a place where you can't attend university together. And of course, Israel is a country where Arabs and Jews and Christians and Muslims do everything. Now, Israel is not a perfect country. And if this were a real in-depth discussion and not a debate where I have to answer everything in a few seconds. By the way, this was a 20-minute debate. I'm just showing you clips from a highlight reel here. But even in a 20-minute debate, on any given question, I may only have a minute to answer. So I can't get into the deeper thought, which is Israel has as much racial tension and discrimination as any other modern Western liberal democracy, and it's not perfect. But it's a country where everyone's equal under law. It's a country where even with the challenges that we have with racial relations, we still have people of all minorities, including Arabs, serving in every position, from government to arts and entertainment and everything. And as I was talking about in the segment, doesn't mean that Israel doesn't have tensions, but Israel is more like the United States or the United Kingdom or Canada or Australia than it is like, say, some dictatorship where people really don't have rights. And that's the point that I'm trying to make in this, which is to put Israel in that category. You know, I don't go say, oh, well, what about Iran? Oh, what about Saudi Arabia? No, I don't even want to compare Israel to countries that are at such a problematic level. I want to compare Israel to the countries that really are trying to do well, even if they don't succeed perfectly.
So because the movement is beginning to have an economic impact, even with major pension funds pulling their investments from Israeli banks or international companies involved in Israel's human rights violations, this is precisely the traction that Israel dreads.
If it really were, you wouldn't be able to use your computer or your cell phone. You wouldn't be able to access much of the clean drinking water on Earth or many of the medications that you use. These are the kinds of exports that Israel creates. A great example is SodaStream. BDS pressured them to move their factory, which costed hundreds of Palestinians their jobs.
How can one be critical?
So you can see what I said there was, I talked about some of the innovations that Israel has. This is very tricky. It's very tempting to want to, I know I froze it on a frame here where my mouth is open in a weird way, so don't laugh at me too much. It's very tempting in this BDS debate to say, oh, you want to boycott Israel? You better stop using your cell phone, your computer, and your vaccinations, your medicines. It's a little bit of a trap, because if somebody really is liberal-minded and thinking about progressive values and human rights, their reaction to you might be, well, just because Israel invents a lot of things doesn't mean that you have the right to oppress people, which is why I spent most of my time saying Israel does not oppress people. I'm not saying what Israel does is okay because Israel invents things. I'm saying that what Israel does is okay because it really is okay, because it really is, there really is equal rights and equal opportunity, and the criticisms are unfair. I'm mostly focused on that. It was just at one point right in the middle where he gave me the opportunity to speak a little bit about the positive things that Israel does. So I put that in the middle, but it wasn't my main focus. And had this been a shorter debate where I had less time and had to really choose which topics I was going to hit, that probably wouldn't be the number one topic I would hit. I would stick to the ones where I really make the point about how Israel is right and doing right on an ethical and moral level. But given that I had the opportunity, it was a reasonable thing to throw in there. Now, this is a really critical question he's about to ask, so I want you to put some thought into it.
Jobs.
How can one be critical of Israel and Israel's policies without being labeled anti-Semitic?
Okay, how can you be critical of Israel and Israel's policies without being labeled anti-Semitic? There's so many ways you could go, and it's really tempting to say which policies, what policies do you have a problem with? Israel's policies really are mostly fair and thoughtful. It's tempting to want to say that. But look, the truth is Israelis disagree about Israeli policies, and at Honest Reporting, our job is not to defend Israel blindly. It's to work to make sure that Israel is treated fairly. We've defended Israel for 20 years, and in that time, there have been prime ministers in Israel on the right, left, and center, and American presidents, Republican and Democrat, and but our defense of Israel has always stayed, no matter who the prime minister was or who the president was. And so, our job is not to defend every single Israeli policy, but to defend the fairness toward Israel. So here in this last segment, the reason I included it is because I bring everything together. Remember, being smart and likable, reaching people where they are. So you'll see that the first thing I did here is I took this very serious question and I started with a smile, and then I made a little joke, and then I talked about something lighthearted, and then I brought it back around to something serious, and I included some facts and some history, but not too much, and brought it all together with reaching people where they are in their values, while also being smart and also being likable. And I put it all together here.
Well, if you're critical of Israel and Israel's policies, you have something in common with just about every person in Israel. We have a joke that we have 9 million prime ministers because everybody thinks they're right. But I'll tell you what, in the world there are 57 Muslim states. There are over 100 Christian states. There are 6 Buddhist states. There's only one Jewish country. It's one of the smaller countries in the world with a size less than New Jersey and a population less than New York City, and it is the only one that is singled out by BDS, not for criticism, but for total destruction. Now, I'm not saying that singling out the world's only Jewish state for total destruction is anti-Semitic, but I can't imagine what else it would be.
All right, so that is our segment. I hope it's helpful for you in terms of thinking through how to talk about these tough issues in a way that doesn't sound angry or defensive, even though these things can be angering and can make you want to be on the defensive, and it's really understandable. But when you are speaking in a way that's angry and defensive, you sound like the sort of person who might be an oppressor. Yeah, I wish it were simple, where you could just go to a single source and be well informed. I mean, if you're interested in learning about Israel, you can look at Israeli publications like the Times of Israel or the Jerusalem Post, and they're often pretty good. But even then, they sometimes might have an agenda. Sometimes they lean a little bit in one way or another, maybe anti-government, which is, it's common in a democratic country. And even the New York Times, for example, they used to have Barry Weiss, and they still have Bret Stephens, who are very positive about Israel and do very thoughtful, accurate writing. And so you get anywhere you go, you get all types. But I would, even CNN, which oftentimes leans very anti-Israel, their outgoing Israel correspondent, Oren Lieberman, is, Jewish guy married to an Israeli woman who did a reasonably fair job while he was here. Unfortunately, he's leaving us. He's getting a promotion and going to cover the Pentagon, I think. But the way to really get accurate information is you do what we do. You start by reading the article and you ask yourself, is there something in here that contradicts? For example, if the headline says one thing and the article itself contradicts the headline, because headlines are written by headline editors who are trying to get clickbait. And so sometimes a headline will be some dramatic thing that'll draw eyeballs, but isn't really correct. You see, or you might see the first paragraph of the article is leaning in one way, and then at the end you see something else. Like, for example, the Gaza protests. You'd see people killed at Gaza protests in the headline, and the first couple of paragraphs talk about the protesters, and then in the last paragraph, you learn that these protesters were throwing hand grenades and firing machine guns, which kind of is not exactly the definition of protester that Martin Luther King is associated with. This is hardly raising picket signs on Capitol Hill. The moment you see that contradiction, you know something's wrong and it's time to dig further. Another thing you can do is read multiple different sources and see, are there certain areas where those sources agree and certain areas where they disagree. If there's something that Fox News is saying and CNN is saying the same thing, then chances are that's probably a point that's not really contested. In the areas where they differ, ask yourself, how do they differ? And is there a way that I can check that thing? Is the way that they differ just that they're emphasizing certain things more than other things, or are they actually having different facts? And then you can go and ask yourself, well, where can I check out that fact? If the question is, does killing a nuclear scientist violate international law? Can you figure out which international laws are out there, and can you look them up yourself and take a look? And it's a little bit more work, but it is a way to build an accurate view of what's going on in the world. Now, what can you do when you see a problem? My personal thought is that it all comes down to community. You can go to our website and see if we've written on it, see if we have a call for action out there. We also have a little red alert button on our homepage, and you can click on that and bring news to our attention and say, hey, I read this article that maybe you should check out. And we can't always cover everything, especially if it's local news and there's a lot of national and international news out there, but we do our best to cover as much as we can. At the very least, we provide you with resources, and if there's a call to action, you can join with the community, and hundreds or thousands of people could write emails together. Well, the first thing to do is to know your stuff, to learn as much as you can. The next thing is to remember that there are some people, like I said, who will always agree with you. Some people will never agree with you, and you don't want to try and convince either of them. And then there's the people in between who are the ones you really want to talk to. And when you do talk to people, if you're the sort of person who likes speaking out, you can write things, you can speak in a community, you can talk to the people you're friends with, you can join groups where you publicly speak out, so you can do it more formally or more informally. And whenever you do, try to implement those values of being smart and likable and reaching people where they are. If you're talking to somebody who cares about progressive liberal values and human rights, talk about Israel's record on human rights. If you're talking to someone who's more right-leaning and is more concerned about security issues, talk about security issues. You're talking to someone from the Christian club, you can talk about Israel's history with Christianity and with different religions. Wherever you go, Israel can stand on its own. But also, I'd say this, you're out there going to college to get an education, and I think it's a little unfair that we have turned our young people into involuntary ambassadors for Israel. So I'd say choose a good school where you can have an environment where you feel reasonably safe and don't have to spend all your time fighting with people, and get a good education and go out there into the world and be strong and successful. You should.
Can you name that?
Mm-hmm.
Can you name that school?
Well, there's so many schools out there, and the ones that get the most publicity tend to be the ones that have the most problems. But there are a lot of schools out there where people are having good experiences too. And I'd say, for me, speaking out about these things brought me a sense of peace, because it was bothering me not speaking out. And you should feel in your own heart where it bothers you, and that's the pain point, and that's when you should speak out and find that sense of peace that comes from expressing yourself and being genuine. But also, you shouldn't feel the pressure to be a political advocate at a moment when you're trying to be a biology student, because that's important too. It's interesting. It's sometimes hard to know if the anti-Semitism is growing or if it's just becoming more obvious and was always sort of there under the surface. But my take is, it's a reality. It exists. It's something that we have to speak out about. In a country with free speech, we have to counter bad ideas with good ideas. When I was in 2009, when I was living in Chicago, I went to a protest that was against Israel's actions in Gaza. It was called a peace protest, and they had people waving swastikas and burning Israeli flags and shouting death to Jews. And I had gone to that protest to mount a little counter protest where we'd wave some Israeli flags just to show there's somebody out there who feels differently. And there were about 5 of us, and the people against Israel, there were 4,000, like a sea of people, an ocean of people. And then the police said to us, look, we can't protect you because there's too many of them. And that was disturbing to me, because in a country with free speech, it doesn't say free speech for the people who are the most violent or the most numerous. It's free speech for everybody. If you can't protect me, you should bring more police until you can protect me. But unfortunately, that was what happened that day. And that was the beginning of the thought process in my mind that eventually led to me moving to Israel, where I feel a greater degree of comfort and safety about these things. And also, now that I go back to America as an Israeli, I'm an Israeli for 9 years now, I feel such a sense of safety and confidence, because when I speak to people, even people who aren't necessarily sympathetic to me, I feel like I have the strength of an entire country and an entire Jewish people behind me. So my advice is to see if you can find that feeling of strength from community and speak from that place of comfort. Yeah, it's, there's an expression in Hebrew, hakol kashur, everything's connected. And as you know very well, Wikipedia is its own universe. And to function in that universe requires a very specific expertise and skill set, which you guys are working on, and it's really admirable. We follow Wikipedia, but we don't get too involved, because what it takes to do that requires something very specific. And that's why I'm very glad that you guys are doing that. Our involvement tends to be, as you said, Wikipedia requires a source. And the sources that have the most credibility in the eyes of Wikipedia, and even in the eyes of most people, are sources such as mainstream news outlets, New York Times, CNN, these big brand names. And these big brand names also, people talk about news is less relevant because of social media, but the truth is most of what you see on social media will be someone posts a news article and then everyone puts their comments on it. So that starting point still begins with mainstream news. And so it has a very important role to play. And people ask me, and I know the people on this call won't ask me because you guys get it, but older people ask me, well, if you make a correction in the New York Times, the original headline was on page 1 and the correction is back on page C23. So what difference does it make because no one sees it? And the answer is there is no page 1 and there is no page C23. Everything's on the internet and it's up there forever. And what's in a New York Times article may be referenced by other journalists or by students or by researchers, or, as you know, by Wikipedia. So getting an article changed really does make a difference, because it changes the conversation for years to come.
Somebody wrote in, there's so many problems happening in the United States from the election and on. Why should people even care about a small country like Israel?
I don't know why people should, but people for some reason do, and they do quite a lot. We actually commissioned a survey by HonestReporting. We haven't released it just yet, but one of the results is that 77% of Americans say that they believe that peace in the Middle East is of critical importance to U.S. national security. The fact is that despite some of the talk that you hear about, America first and that sort of thing, and Americans should put America first, but what you might not realize is that Americans realize that putting America first involves being involved in certain other places in the world, and that includes the Middle East, that Americans realize does affect America. And for whatever reason, Americans do care, whether they should or not. Now, whether they should, I do believe Americans should care. I mean, we saw that when we pulled out of Iraq, that was the genesis of ISIS, which ended up going on to take over Syria, have a civil war that killed 500,000 people, and had a flood of refugees all over Europe. It changed the nature of our world in many countries outside of the Middle East. And that's just one example. If Iran goes nuclear, that will have an impact on the world, including on the United States. Iran is also, they're not just developing nuclear weapons, they're also developing long-range missiles. Things that happen, if oil production gets shut down, that affects the entire world. There are the terrorism that affected us on 9/11 came from people who were mostly from Saudi Arabia and had been learning in these madrasas and Islamic schools throughout the Middle East. So everything, like I said, akol kashur, everything's connected, and both economically and in terms of security, what happens in the Middle East affects America very much. Well, we have an editorial department, which is the content editors, the people who read the news every day and write responses. That's actually where I started. I worked there for 3 years before I was promoted to CEO. And now I sometimes miss getting to read and write and just be jumping into news every day instead of doing management and all these other things. But I do get to do it once in a while still. And then we also have our Media Central team that's running press conferences and press trips. And we also have our video production team that's making YouTube videos, which you can watch that get information out and really short, very clear little videos. And we're starting a long form interview program now that we're doing. And then we also have our missions and events groups, which right now we can't do in-person missions, but we did a virtual mission, and we do a lot of webinars, which are events that we also do. So we have all these different groups in addition to the back office stuff. We've got our finance and all those other things. So those are all the different groups, and they all work together. And when we see an article that's problematic, ideally, if we can, we just pick up the phone or write an email to the journalist. And if we have a relationship, it may get resolved. And if that doesn't work, we may have to write a critique and a call to action. Sometimes we just ask people to write into the editors. Sometimes we might put together a petition. For example, one thing that we did, you can see all the puzzle pieces here, is Saib Erekat, who was recently deceased. Before we knew he was going to get COVID and pass away, he was hired to be a fellow at Harvard University. And I took the position that, it's not Honest Reporting's job to tell Harvard what to do, but it is our job to say the media ought to be covering this with all the facts so that people know. And so that people maybe say, hey, I don't think I want to support Harvard or attend Harvard or give donations to Harvard if they're doing this. So we put out a petition saying that everyone should encourage the media to talk about this more. And our plan was to then take that petition to the Boston Globe, because that's where Harvard is, or possibly to the New York Times, and write an op-ed in the mainstream media explaining what the situation is so the maximum number of people could see it. And we got over 10,000 signatures on the petition, which I think would have been really persuasive to the editors at the Boston Globe. But then Erekat got ill and then passed away. And obviously, he's not going to be taking that position because he's no longer alive. So we left the campaign at that. But that is an example of how we would put the various different departments and things we do together in a unified effort to make a difference. We feel our position up until now has been, we sometimes talk about this and debate about this, but so far our feeling is that in Israel, there's a conversation. If Haaretz, which is very left-leaning, says one thing, everybody in Israel knows that Yisrael Hayom, which is very right-leaning, is going to say the other thing. And there are others that are kind of in between, and people get that here. They don't need us to point that out. It's outside of Israel when someone says something misleading that you may not realize that quote from Haaretz is just one opinion within the spectrum of opinions within Israel. So it's really abroad in the international conversation that we feel that our work is most needed. We do. Our feeling in the past was that we dealt with them only on a limited basis because we don't want to engage too much with a news source that's never going to change anyway. But we're starting to rethink that and say that, because people read the news source, even if we can't get them to change their content, at the very least, people should be aware of where they're being misleading. But I'll tell you what, people don't realize Al Jazeera is owned by the King of Qatar. He's or the Emir is his official title. It's not a regular professional news source. Like if you think New York Times is bad because it's owned by people with an agenda, it's at least not owned by a government of a country without free speech. My favorite Al Jazeera story was a few years ago when they published a story that that Israel had opened all of the dams in southern Israel and flooded Gaza, and they showed pictures of the streets in Gaza flooding. Well, if you've ever been to southern Israel, it's a desert. It's called the Negev. There are no dams in southern Israel because there are no rivers in southern Israel to dam up. And so it was just so obviously wrong. And the reason Gaza had flooded was because they spend all their money on attack tunnels rather than spending it on things like regular municipal drainage systems.
So Daniel, this has been phenomenal. And the responses that we're getting from the people is that you're wonderful, and you are. And so I just want to say to all the people out there, definitely sign up, go to Honest Reporting, support them, sign up to their newsletters. It's phenomenal. And also for the Israel Group to keep this series going and all the work that we're doing. We're a nonprofit. We can use support from everywhere. And Daniel, thank you again very much. And let me just remind everybody, next week, we have another wonderful event, and we hope you all come to this. Daniel, thank you very much. Shalom, shalom.
Thank you, Jack. Thanks for having me, and thank you, everybody.